Ici, Londres. Veuillez écouter maintenant quelques messages personnels. Les girafes ne portent pas de faux cols. Andromaque se parfume à la lavande.
June the 6th, 1944. While the Allies were landing on the beaches of Normandy, 700 kilometers to the south, a fighting division of the Waffen-SS, the 2nd Panzer Das Reich Division, had been stationed for 3 months around the town of Montauban in the south of France. After many feats of arms on the Eastern Front, the veterans were resting. The 15,000 men that made up the division were divided into the barracks and camps along the banks of the Garonne River down to Toulouse. Higher-ranking officers and NCOs were billeted to requisitioned houses where the residents supplied them with board and lodging. New recruits were subjected to a diet of steady training and taught to handle weapons. On the morning of D-Day, the Das Reich Division received this alarmist message broadcast by German headquarters.
Feindinvasion beim Morgengrauen ausgebrochen. 6 unmittelbare Bewegung, Dispositionen treffen.
Dawn, June the 8th. The 2nd Panzer Das Reich Division left Montauban, heading north toward Normandy. The Das Reich was the flagship of the SS divisions. Devised in 1925 as Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard, the Schutzstaffel, or SS, became a huge militia in the service of the Hitler regime, a real state within a state. The combat divisions of the Waffen-SS were called the firefighters of the front.
La Waffen-SS, formation de guerre, s'est d'abord recrutée parmi les SS, membres du Parti national-socialiste, choisis pour constituer les sections de protection. Depuis, le recrutement s'est étendu jusqu'aux autres nations européennes. Ce n'est pas seulement une unité militaire, c'est aussi un ordre puissant où chaque membre reçoit une instruction morale et politique qui le rend digne de faire partie d'une élite.
Unlike the Wehrmacht, the regular army, the better-equipped Waffen-SS only answered to the orders of Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler. Number 2 in the regime, as well as the supreme head of the SS, he went in person to Montauban on April the 11th, 1944, where he was greeted in great pomp by the officers of the Panzer Division. His men were among the most decorated of the Third Reich. 69 Iron Crosses rewarded the soldiers who had distinguished themselves in battles in France and the Soviet Union. The Das Reich Division was placed under the command of Heinz Bernhard Lammerding. Born in 1905, this former civil engineer, a Nazi from the beginning, had an impressive pedigree. He was an experienced SS soldier coupled with a mass murderer who led special commando units in Belarus and the Baltic states. Intelligent, ambitious, and unscrupulous, Lamedink took part in all the battles that followed the invasion of the Soviet Union, begun on June the 22nd, 1941. In Ukraine, he commanded a combat unit of the Das Reich division. Chiefly composed of Panzer IV latest generation tanks and armored vehicles, the Panzer Division was a cornerstone of Operation Barbarossa, the plan to invade and annex the Soviet Union. The Das Reich had nevertheless suffered a terrible defeat against the Soviets in Kursk in the Kharkov region. In August 1943, Hitler lost 50,000 men and 16,000 tanks in what remains the greatest armored confrontation in the history of the Second World War. In the summer of '44, the Das Reich division lost half of its men on the Eastern Front. Of the 15,000 men gathered in Montauban, 9,000 had never fired a shot in anger. Youngsters from Hungary, Croatia, Romania, 3 countries allied with Nazi Germany, but also former Soviet prisoners of war, freed in exchange for signing up, had been recruited by the Division SS. Most of the troops came from a French region called Alsace. Elimar Schneider, aged 17, had been enlisted months earlier in an Alsace annexed in 1940 by the Third Reich. He would long remember his Waffen-SS medical examination.
At the review board, a Waffen-SS officer, assessing my young sportsman body and looking me straight in the eye, asked me if I had flat feet. He smiled at my negative response and retorted, "You too will get the stamp." I didn't understand right away, but after an extremely thorough medical examination, I received my military record book bearing the famous stamp saying, "Passed for service in the Waffen-SS." It was one way of claiming that I was a volunteer, though I'd signed nothing, no enlistment papers.
To the Nazi military administration, Elimar Schneider was a Volksdeutscher, an ethnic German born outside of Germany. In 1944, between 1,000 and 2,000 Alsatians were enlisted in the Das Reich division. When he set off for Normandy on June the 8th, 1944, Elimar Schneider was part of a division whose combat equipment was for the most part obsolete or faulty. Despite that, the Das Reich still represented a major threat to the Allies. With its armor and its numbers, the ferocity of its officers, the SS division alone could counteract the Anglo-Americans, and quite possibly reverse the outcome of the conflict. Its generals also knew that the road trip would be no picnic. The Das Reich would have to cross territory where the most feared resistance groups in France operated. Attack and ambush would be a permanent fear. For the resistance movement, the time for open confrontation with the occupying troops had come. General de Gaulle's message via the BBC on the evening of June the 6th was unequivocal.
La bataille suprême est engagée. C'est la bataille de France et c'est la bataille de la France. Pour les fils de France, où qu'ils soient, quel qu'il soit, le devoir simple et sacré est de combattre par tous les moyens dont ils disposent. Il s'agit de détruire l'ennemi.
In the regions that the SS division was about to cross, Dordogne, Limousin, the partisans' mission was clear: to prevent the Das Reich from reaching Normandy. The resistance had to do anything in its power to slow its progress. Between the Gaullist Secret Army and the Communist FTP, it could count on 20,000 members eager to fight. The resistance, which until then had to cope with a constant shortage of arms and equipment, finally had the means to give battle. During the first 6 months of 1944, the Royal Air Force dropped 3,627 tons of arms over French territory, 10 times more than the preceding year. The drops weren't limited to combat equipment. In Britain, men and women from Norway, Yugoslavia, and France were being trained in sabotage and commando tactics before being parachuted into their country of origin to unite resistance groups scattered over the territory. Agents of the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, British intelligence, supporting the resistance from their London headquarters, had but one watchword: set Europe ablaze. This meant actions of sabotage, blowing up bridges and factories, sinking enemy ships. And at the same time, they had to re-establish radio links with London and train resistance fighters, mostly civilians, to handle small arms. On the night of June the 7th, 4 of the best French SOE agents were parachuted into the Limousin region. All were seasoned combat veterans who had already tangled with German roadblocks and Gestapo undercover agents in the Rouen region. All were under 35. Philippe Liévert, alias Staunton, a Jewish resistance fighter, underground since 1940. Robert Maloubier, alias Mortier, the young radio operator Jean-Claude Guillet, and Violette Szabo, codename Louise. This Anglo-French woman of 23 split her childhood between London and Paris. A dazzling beauty with an intense gaze, she was the widow of a soldier of the Free French forces who died at the Battle of El Alamein. Violette Szabo left her 2-year-old daughter Tanya in London. During a mission carried out 2 months earlier on French soil, she had shown exceptional coolness and daring. Despite her youth, she was one of the most valuable SOE assets. To halt the Das Reich, it was vital to establish contact with the FTP colonel Georges Guingouin, head of the Limousin Maquis. A member of the resistance since 1940, feared by the Gestapo, hunted by Vichy, Ganguin was the architect of many operations to sabotage the occupying forces. The communist resistance was in the habit of going it alone and taking no notice of directives from London. They took initiatives that seemed to ignore any chain of command, their own chiefs included. In this context, meeting Ganguin was a necessity. He was the only one who could sound the call to order. Scarcely had they arrived than the SOE agents were presented with a fait accompli. They were told that the Front Tireur Partisan, or FTP, a squad of irregulars, had entered the town of Tulle at dawn on June the 7th to liberate the Corrèze prefecture, a reckless operation with unpredictable consequences. In a few hours, the resistance managed to drive the German troops back into the munitions factory. After a few exchanges of gunfire at the end of the day, the town fell to the FTP. On the morning of June the 8th, buoyed by the success of their action, some members of the resistance had left town, not suspecting that the Das Reich and its long armored columns were advancing towards them. 130 kilometers south, in the town of Cahors, the Das Reich division split into three to follow separate itineraries. It had received the order to clean the zones it was passing through of gangs of terrorists. This meant that all pockets of resistance on the way, mainly those in Limousin, were to be eliminated. The 1st Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment took a different route. The divisional staff continued on its way towards the city of Limoges. 7,500 Waffen-SS, armed and experienced, along with hundreds of vehicles, led the way to Tulle. Their progress was slowed somewhat by the panzers and other armor that the Wehrmacht refused to transport by rail. Nonetheless, a certain number had been loaded onto flatbed freight cars in the town of Montauban to be taken via Brive to Normandy. Along the country roads, the Das Reich crossed ghost towns. The SS had left no good memories there. A few kilometers north in the village of Montpezat-de-Quercy, on May the 2nd, 1944, soldiers of the Das Reich division shot 15 civilians in retaliation for sabotage of the Toulouse to Paris rail line. Around the small town of Figeac, on May the 11th and 12th, 1944, assisted by the Gestapo and the militia, they stormed into around 20 villages, arresting almost 800 people in 2 days, burning and looting farms as they went. On May the 21st, in the hamlet of Fraissinet-le-Gélat, west of Figeac, 3 women were hanged from their balcony and 10 men were executed before the village was torched. June the 7th, on the eve of their departure, guided by the Gestapo in the town of Agen, a battalion of the Das Reich executed 10 partisans and 7 civilians. At that point, the villagers knew what to expect and were unlikely to show themselves. The commander of the 1st Der Führer Battalion, Adolf Rainer Diekmann, was charged with protecting the division's left flank. Artillery battalions and part of the Deutschland Regiment were in the vanguard to counter any resistance attacks. Diekmann was on his guard. His regiment had just entered the Dordogne region, a reputedly dangerous zone. Next came Limousin, where the resistance was particularly active. A region the general commander of the SS forces called Little Russia. Diekmann was well aware of the partisans' trump cards, their knowledge of the terrain and their mobility compared to the slow column of military vehicles. At the same time, SOE agents Violette, Szabo, Philippe Liévert, Jean-Claude Guillet, and Robert Maloubier were greeted by 30 secret army members commanded by Jacques Dufour, alias Anastasie. They stared at the Gaullist combatants in Limousin with concern. Despite their numbers and enthusiasm, they were mainly young with no combat experience. Hotheads driving with full headlights down roads the Das Reich would soon be coming up. But they'd have to make do. The resistance set to work. They set up roadblocks and watched keenly, awaiting the passage of the Panzer Division. Barely had the SS set foot in Dordogne than they found themselves under fire from the resistance. Diekmann's men were attacked in the hamlet of Gros-les-Jacques. A dozen resistance men died during the attacks. Ten kilometers from there in Roufillac, Diekmann faced another group of combatants at the bridge marking the entrance to the village. In front of the people gathered at the village restaurant, he had 16 civilians and 2 resistance men shot as reprisals. Their remains were doused in gasoline and burned where they lay. Women and children were among the victims. Then the regiment continued its way toward the city of Limoges. Diekmann knew he had nothing to fear from his superiors. Any sanctions or punitive operations were covered by his hierarchy. In fact, they were encouraged. The orders of Marshal Sperl, deputy commander of the Western Front, issued on February the 10th, exposed in detail the procedures to be implemented. Order concerning the fight against terrorists. Respond promptly to any attacks by terrorist gangs. If innocents should be slain, then the fact is regrettable, but due to the terrorists alone. Owing to the current situation, showing excessive severity in the measures taken will not result in any sanctions. The arrival in the town of Brive-la-Gaillarde of the reconnaissance battalion that preceded the column was an ominous sign. The SS had tied to the hood of a half-track the remains of Maurice Vergne, a resistance man killed in a skirmish in Cressensac, 20 kilometers previously. This macabre trophy was a warning to the people of Brive and to the Gaullist maquis that organized the ambush. An ambush meant to protect resistance weapons caches in barns around Brive, the last stage before Tulle. When the residents of Tulle awoke on the morning of June the 9th, the town was once again under German control. In the night, assisted by the French militia, the reconnaissance battalion, 500 men armed with 100 machine guns and a squadron of armored vehicles, had easily retaken the town from the resistance. Exhausted by the previous day's fighting and short of ammunition, the FTP fled the town, caught in a pincer movement, in order to limit the loss of human life. Reprisals were not slow in coming. Dragged forcibly from their beds, all men from 16 to 60, more than 2,000 people, were herded at dawn into the courtyard of the munitions factory. Aurel Kovac, divisional intelligence officer, gave the order. Walter Schmalt, a member of the Gestapo, and Heinrich Wulff, commander of the Das Reich Reconnaissance Battalion, were charged with its execution. During the morning, Pierre Trouillet, prefect of the region, negotiated with the SS to free the hostages. He managed to obtain the release of men who were needed to keep the town running. A low-key victory. At noon, 600 were still waiting to learn their fate. Meanwhile, Alsatian Elimar Schneider was patrolling the town, warning inhabitants of the punishment they faced. Gathered in the streets around Souillac Square, the townsfolk found a message posted on the walls. Citizens of Tulle, 40 German soldiers were murdered in the most dreadful manner by communist gangs. For resistance fighters and those who aid and abet them, there is but one sentence, that of hanging. 40 German soldiers were murdered by the resistance. 120 of the resistance or their accomplices will be hanged. Their bodies will be thrown in the river. The warning was signed by the SS Division General Heinz Lammerdink. At 3:30 in the afternoon, in the munitions factory, the 120 men demanded by Lammerdink were selected and taken from the ranks. In the town center, soldiers from Heinrich Wulff's reconnaissance battalion were asking the town's inhabitants for ropes, which they then tied around street lamps and from the balconies of buildings. A mission, as Elimar Schneider points out, entrusted to the most experienced.
We chose hanging because it is more humiliating than being shot. The executioners were appointed from the company of pioneers, mainly composed of German men, half of them soldiers from our company who'd come from the Russian front.
After obtaining the release of several hostages, Prefect Trouillet tried to convince Aurel Kovac to postpone the executions. "I'm sorry," Kovac retorted. "We got used to hangings in Russia. We hanged 100,000 men between Kharkov and Kiev. To us, this is nothing." The officers of the Das Reich, all veterans of the Eastern Front, were only repeating in Tulle practices already tried out in Kiev, Minsk, and Kharkov. In the wake of the invasion by the Third Reich that began in June 1941, Soviet towns were turned into forests of hanged men. This war terrorism, designed to humiliate the punished by inflicting an unmanly death, according to the SS expression, had a dissuasive function. Like here in Pančevo, Yugoslavia, on April the 22nd, 1941, when the Das Reich was present. In the conquered territories, the Nazis enlisted the assistance of local collaborators, such as the militia in France. They're the ones we see in these pictures, doing the dirty work. In Tulle, around 3:30 p.m., a first group of 10 from among the men selected was hanged from the street lamps, trees, and balconies of Souillac Square and the adjacent streets. The SS forced the residents to witness their ordeal. On the other side of the square, on the terrace of the Tivoli Café, men from the Das Reich, drinking and laughing to the sound of a gramophone, attended the show. One SS soldier drew pictures of the hangings. The victims were finished off with a pistol shot or a burst from a machine gun. Then the next 10 men were led to the gallows. Can we imagine the scene? Asked Abbé Espinasse, chaplain of Tulle High School. Men immobile under duress, soldiers below the gallows, groups of hostages led to their crucifixion. The hangings continued throughout the afternoon. At the end of the day, Elimar Schneider went to the munitions factory, where the last few prisoners awaited.
Entering by the factory gate, I asked how many hostages remained, informing him that there were not enough ropes. Walter Schmalde pointed to a group kneeling to the left of the entrance, a dozen civilians, and a group of around 20 in front of him. In front of them stood a chaplain in a faded cassock, his face sad. It was Abbé Espinasse giving them absolution.
The Tulle school chaplain ceaselessly negotiated with Walter Schmalt for the lives of the hostages, managing to save a handful of them. At 7 in the evening, after 98 hangings and one man gunned down trying to escape, the lack of available ropes led Schmalt to end the executions. The 500 forced spectators were imprisoned in Limoges. Half of them would be deported to Dachau concentration camp. Of the 120 men sentenced to the rope, only 21 escaped that fate. The victims were between 17 and 46. They included students, insurers, hairdressers, typographers, dairymen, plumbers, accountants, engineers, and only 2 resistance men. In the evening, members of the French youth camps, an 8-month military service set up by the Vichy collaborationist regime, cut down the hanged men, who were transported by truck to the town dump and tossed onto the rubble. "75 kilometers from Tulle, a wind of panic blew through a detachment of the Das Reich. The car of the commander of the 3rd Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment had been found by the side of the road without its passenger. Former printer Helmut Kempf, a hero among elite SS combatants, was a personal friend of General Heinz Lammerdink and Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann. This giant, called Golden Mouth by his comrades as he had replaced all his teeth with gold ones, had disappeared without trace. Roadblocks were hastily set up. Roads and copses searched thoroughly. A few hours earlier, in Combouvert, the Kempf regiment had fallen into an ambush set by the communist resistance. 31 partisans had been taken prisoner and immediately shot on his orders. Laid out along the road, their corpses had then been crushed by the Das Reich panzers. Georges Gangouin's FTP unit was suspected of having abducted Kempf as retaliation. After a day's hunting, night fell and interrupted the quest. They continued the next day at first light. Not far away, Violette, Szabo, and Anastasie headed for Pompadour, outside of Limoges. There, they were to meet other SOE agents in order to coordinate their actions with the Gaullist secret army. Neither knew that the Waffen-SS were combing the area in search of Major Kempf. Suddenly, on the outskirts of Salon-la-Tour, they noticed a motorcyclist taking a bend at top speed, followed by a detachment of the Das Reich. It was too late to turn tail. A shootout began. The resistance fighters abandoned their vehicle and made for the undergrowth. Violette stumbled and twisted her ankle. Helpless, she emptied her magazine on the SS to give Anastasie a head start. He escaped his pursuers, but Violette Szabo was taken prisoner. Meanwhile, the Der Führer regiment had obtained intelligence to put it on the trail of Helmut Kempf. Captured the day before by the FTP, Lieutenant Karl Gerlach suddenly reappeared. He had escaped from the village where the resistance had set up its base, he confirmed. Their arms caches were no doubt there. Gerlach had heard that an SS officer had also been taken prisoner. In all probability, this was Major Kempf. Though the indications supplied by Gerlach didn't match its location, it was a village called Oradour-sur-Glane that Adolf Diekmann pointed out on the map at headquarters. This calls for ruthless repression, declared the SS officer, a cold-blooded killer, barely 30 years old, responsible for many massacres in the East. Otto Kahn, commander of the Third Company, a career soldier who joined the Das Reich in 1940, and his direct subordinate Heinz Barth would head operations. Entering the SS at 18, after ideological and sporting training with the Hitler Youth, Barth was a veteran at fighting the Soviets. An instructor with the Das Reich in 1943, then a policeman in Czechoslovakia, he went from one Waffen-SS unit to the next, including the 3rd Totenkopf Division with its sinister reputation. Elite troops, the Death's Head SS soldiers. Barth, Kahn, and other veterans from the Russian front hadn't only been fighting the Soviet army in the East. The invasion of the USSR in June 1941 also had the goal of eliminating any potential enemies of the Reich, in other words, communists and the Jewish populations of Eastern Europe. Men old enough to bear arms were the first victims of the repressive units of the SS. They were shot en masse as the German troops progressed through Soviet territory, from Latvia to the south of Ukraine, from Galicia to Russia. From August 1941, the genocide order was given to German formations in the field. Jewish women and children were among the main targets of the mass slaughter led by the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units. Too weak in numbers, these special commandos enlisted the collaboration of the Wehrmacht, the Feldgendarmerie, and the Waffen-SS. The Das Reich division, in which Kahn had learned his trade, was mentioned in report number 92 of Einsatzgruppen, dated September the 23rd, 1941, which reported on the activities of Group B in the region of Minsk, Belarus. In a few hours, 920 men, women, and children, the entire Jewish population of Lahoysk, were massacred in the large pits dug for them on the road to Jena. With the extermination of the Jews accomplished, the German occupying forces, harassed by the communist partisans, took revenge on the civilian population. From 1942, missions of repression followed one another at a frenzied rate. The modus operandi was identical. The inhabitants were gathered in the village square, the men were executed, the women and children held in a barn or in the church, which was then sprayed by machine gun fire before being torched. The whole village was then burned. In Belarus, 628 villages were razed and their inhabitants burned alive by the SS. Over less than 4 years' German occupation, that represents one village every 2 days. As for Heinz Barth, he became a criminal against humanity in Czechoslovakia. The head of the Reich Security Service, Reinhard Heydrich, had just met his death in Prague following an attack carried out by 2 Czech SOE agents. The Führer had designated the village of Lidis, suspected of protecting resistance fighters, as the price of atonement. On June the 10th, 1942, Heinz Barth took part in surrounding the town before commanding a firing squad. 184 men aged 16 and over were shot under his command in Lidis. The women were deported to Ravensbrück camp, the children to the extermination camp at Czerno, or entrusted to Lebensborn, the nurseries for the ideal Aryan society imagined by Hitler. The dwellings were first burned and then blown up with dynamite. After the German road workers had passed through, no trace of Lidis remained, not even ruins. These were the men who were about to enter Oradour-sur-Glane on June the 10th, 1944. A village with no links to the resistance, but whose population had almost doubled, swelled by Spanish, Alsatian, and Jewish refugees. Oradour was a typical village of the region. Its 15th century church, its small shops and farms, its tramway line, made the vibrant little township into a picture postcard. That Saturday, in the market square, men were standing in line for the distribution of tobacco, while the children gathered at the gates of 3 municipal schools for their medical exam. A weekend like any other. As if the war had spared this village since the roundup in August 1942, when the Jewish members of the 642nd Foreign Workers Group were arrested and deported to Auschwitz. While the 2 armored cars and Diekman's trucks stopped a few kilometers short of the village, Heinz Barth turned to his men before they continued and said, "Today, you will see blood flow." Diekman, Kahn, and Barth were about to subject Oradour to the same treatment as Logoisk, as Lidis, as the 628 Belarusian villages raised from the surface of the earth by the death troops of the SS. Procedures of intense violence, perfectly reconstructed in the film by the Soviet director L.M. Klimov, Come and See. Set in Belarus, the gripping realism of this 1985 fictional account completely corroborates the testimonies of the survivors of Oradour-sur-Glane, Marguerite Roufanche, 47 at the time, and Robert Ebras, 19.
On June the 10th, 1944, I was on leave in Oradour with my parents. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Germans arrived in armored cars. They got out and they made us go to the market square. I was there at the roundup with my mother and my 2 sisters.
Soldiers who were doing the rounds came to our home. They said, "Everyone, market square." And that was it. We all had to go.
They separated the women and children from the group. Up to the age of 14, children went with their mothers. Above that, they were considered men. I was 19. I went with the men's group.
The worst moment was when we had to split up. They separated the men from the women, and my son wouldn't let me go. We were taken to the church, and the men went to the barns.
All the young people were together. We weren't thinking of what was going to happen. We were interested in the next day's football match. They made us all get to our feet. Just then, I had an Alsatian friend who could speak German, and he was next to me. And he said, "Look out, they're shooting." He didn't even have time to finish the sentence. Right then, they fired several bursts of machine gun fire right at us. When they'd stopped shooting, they checked the bodies and finished off those they saw stirring. They were firing handguns, machine guns. They fired into the crowd. I was wounded. Then they covered us in hay and firewood, whatever was in the barn, and they set fire to us.
We had been locked in the church. The Germans brought in this big crate. I said to someone, "See that? That's a bomb. We're going to be blown up with a church." "Oh," she said, "don't say such things." And the fact is, the box exploded. It gave off such a lot of smoke, we were suffocating. We couldn't see in the church, and cries went up on all sides. My eldest girl had lost her little baby. Then she found him, but I don't know if he was alive or dead. But my youngest girl was killed by a bullet from outside. As for the other, the eldest, she was burned alive. And that's when I jumped out of the window.
At nightfall, while Marguerite Bouffanche, between life and death after 3 bullets to the body, waited for the Germans to leave, while Robert Ebras, hidden, witnessed the burning of the village, the SS, under Diekmann, seized motorcycles, cars and cattle. Kahn helped himself to a blue Peugeot, and Bart to the grocer's cash register. In Nieul, not far from the still smoking ruins of Oradour, the SS requisitioned a school in which they feasted and drank late into the night. On the General Staff map dated June the 11th, the Germans drew a ring around the area where the butchery was committed the day before and in red ink noted the figure of 500 dead. In actual fact, 642 people were murdered in Oradour-sur-Glane on June the 10th, 1944. Of the men locked in barns and sheds, there were only 5 survivors. Of the women and children burned alive in the church, only Marguerite Bouffanche survived. For Diekmann, this was also about completing the training of the rookies under his orders. These young Alsatians, Ukrainians and Hungarians had only just joined the Das Reich. Before the massacre, they hadn't been blooded, as extermination strategists in the East called it. None of them now could claim to be innocent of the crimes of the SS. Oradour wasn't an isolated case in Western Europe. In Italy, in Belgium, in Greece, SS divisions sent to the West after operating in the Soviet Union perpetrated similar slayings, using methods employed daily in Ukraine and Belarus. In Italy, August the 12th, 1944, the battalion of the 16th Panzer Division, led by Walter Redder, veteran of the Totenkopf Division and the Battle of Kharkov, executed the 560 women, children and old men of the Tuscan village of Sant'Anna di Stazzema before setting it alight. Several weeks later, near Bologna, this same unit executed the 955 inhabitants of Marzabotto. As in Oradour, no link was established between the civilian population and any group of partisans. When leaving Oradour-sur-Glane, Diekmann asked his men to say nothing of the events of the day. If necessary, they would say they had discovered an arms cache belonging to the resistance to justify the repression. As for Helmut Kampf, whose disappearance triggered the massacre, he was executed on the direct orders of Georges Guingouin after the head of the communist FTP heard of the SS crimes in Oradour. His body was never found. The next day, a contingent of the Das Reich returned to Oradour to erase all traces of the massacre. The sheds were cleared, the charred bodies of women and children buried in a mass grave. Kahn and Barth's men were already back in the main unit. The order had been given to waste no time in reaching the Normandy front.
Zur Unterstützung der eigenen Kräfte kamen Verstärkungen aus dem Westen und aus dem Reich heran. Aber es war nunmehr deutlich, dass diese Kräfte nicht ausreichten, um den Feind wieder ins Meer zu werfen. Deshalb befahl der Führer, dass weiter zugeführt werden sollten die 2. Panzerdivision, das 1. Panzerregiment der 116. Panzerdivision, die 2. SS-Panzerdivision Das Reich, die zuletzt zu Säuberungen in Südfrankreich eingesetzt wurde.
June the 12th, 8:45 a.m. The Der Führer regiment was en route north to the cities of Tours and Poitiers. Not without difficulty, rounding up a division spread over a 30-kilometer radius had been no easy task. What's more, its equipment and combat vehicles were in an alarming state. 60% of tanks and 30% of half-tracks were unserviceable. The defective panzers should have been ditched between Montauban and Tulle. Lammerding complained to his superiors. Despite these annoyances, the Das Reich still held a few trump cards, in particular the dozens of panzers that left Montauban on flatbed cars heading for Normandy. The SOE was aware of this. Based on information delivered by André Malraux, the Allied commander in the region of Dordogne, bombers were sent to pound them in the cities of Angoulême and Poitiers. Philippe Liévert, head of Violette Szabo's commando unit, asked the Gaullist secret army to step up sabotage operations. The electricity supply to the German submarines based in Rochefort was cut. The Paris to Limoges railway line was dynamited. In Salon-la-Tour, the same place that days earlier Violette had tangled with the Das Reich, Liévert and Molubier derailed 2 trains launched one against the other. It took the Germans 2 months to repair the rails. By June the 13th, 91% of the 1,055 operations against the railway programmed by Allied command had been carried out. As for Violette Szabo, she was in deep trouble. Captured by the Das Reich, she had been handed over to the Gestapo in Limoges. Her true identity had quickly been discovered, and the task of interrogating her had fallen to the executioner of Tulle, Aurel Kovacs. Her SOE comrades couldn't bring themselves to abandon her. A rescue operation was planned for June the 16th. Twice a day, Violette was taken out of her cell and walked between 2 policemen to Gestapo headquarters. They had to take advantage of those 200 meters during which she was not handcuffed. Maloubier was to fire at the two policemen from the back seat of a car before taking Violette. The day came, but SOE commandos drew a blank. That same morning, Violette had been transferred to Gestapo headquarters in Paris. By June the 18th, the Das Reich division was only kilometers from the Normandy front. With its regiments gathered in Saint-Lô, it readied itself for battle. The Allies still only occupied a thin strip of land along the coast. Though the Americans gained ground heading towards Cherbourg, the Germans defended better than expected and held General Montgomery's British troops in check at Caen. While equipment was being unloaded on the landing beaches by the Allies, Charles de Gaulle, just back on French soil, was given an ovation in the liberated town of Bayeux. But nothing was yet decided. Taking advantage of a storm to cut the Allies' supply lines, the Germans took back the advantage. This was the decisive moment for the Das Reich, which had only lost 40 men on its slow climb toward the north. Elimar Schneider, the Alsatian from the Deutschland regiment, had a heavy heart as the fighting drew near.
On the way, a huge aircraft flew over us. At the same time, we heard explosions. It didn't bode well, and my heart began to beat faster. I thought it must be an American bomber getting rid of its last bombs that it couldn't drop over Germany.
Hitler, who by now was directing operations personally, decided to attempt a breakthrough between Caumont and Saint-Lô. On June the 29th, 4 Panzer SS divisions were mobilized to take back Bayeux, with the Das Reich in the vanguard. Lammerding sent in the 1st Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment, that of Diekmann and Kahn, two of the main culprits of the massacre in Oradour-sur-Glane. German propaganda emphasized the decisive nature of the battle and the fighting spirit of the troops on the ground.
Mit jedem Tag steigert sich diese Auseinandersetzung auf einem Bruchteil des europäischen Kontinents. Das Zusammentreffen entwickelt sich immer mehr und mehr zu einer Vernichtungsschlacht größten Ausmaßes. Deutsche Panzer, Sturmgeschütze und Artillerie auf Selbstparapette stoßen im Raum von Bayeux zum Gegenangriff gegen britisch-amerikanische Einheiten vor.
In reality, the operation was a dismal failure. It ended in carnage for the Germans. After 2 days fighting, the Der Führer regiment had lost 600 men. Diekmann was dead, decapitated by a Sherman tank. Kahn had his left arm ripped off. He was repatriated to be treated at the rear. Next day, the Das Reich positions were pounded by 250 bombers from the Royal Air Force. During the month of July, the Wehrmacht fell back but held firm. The Das Reich units, in support of the German army, constantly shifted around to contain the Allied offensives, were at the end of their tether. Sometimes the enemy was British, sometimes American. Successes were short-lived, and the balance of power was shifting daily in the Allies' favor. The Das Reich had joined battle too late. But for the resistance ambushes and the abuses committed on the way, it could have made the difference. It had to make do with plugging the holes. Operation Cobra commenced on July the 24th. No fewer than 4,000 tons of bombs rained down on Normandy in what was the largest display of carpet bombing in the Second World War. Das Reich Commander General Heinz Lammerdink, wounded during the bombing, was evacuated from the front. The Americans, maintaining their positions, gained ground everywhere. In 4 days, Coutances, Avranches, and then Granville were liberated. At the rear, in the region of Saint-Lô, a welcoming committee awaited Kahn, who was recovering from his wounds. A military SS judge had come to hear his version of events in Oradour-sur-Glane. The apostolic nuncio and the prefect of the Limoges region, who visited the scene of the massacre, had complained to Pierre Laval's government of collaborationists.
I want to emphasize that the village of Oradour was one of the quietest towns in the region, and its hard-working, peaceful population was known for its moderation. These details enable you to renew your protest to the government of the Reich, insisting on the appallingly heinous nature of such reprisals, the huge emotion they have aroused, and the terror in which the people now find themselves.
The Vichy government demanded explanations.
The Marshal was greatly moved to learn about the cruel and inhuman treatment meted out to the town of Oradour-sur-Glane and its population. Having made a solemn protest to the head of the German government about such acts that nothing can justify, he proposes to send, as soon as circumstances permit, a member of his cabinet to bow in his name at the scene where so many innocent victims and even children met with the most appalling death.
The members of the resistance who entered Oradour on June the 12th filmed the village in ruins. The discovery of charred corpses and ruined buildings was an unprecedented shock. They sent a damning report to London based on the testimonies of the survivors and evidence provided by forensic examiners. In his statement, Kahn stuck to the line dreamed up by Diekmann. Oradour was hiding stocks of weapons for the resistance. The SS judge, who delivered his verdict 6 months later, aligned with this version of events. Internally, the case was dismissed. French protests were not passed on to Hitler. The Führer's special envoy refused to disturb him for something so trivial. Hitler had other fish to fry. Outraged by what he saw as his general's defeatism and the military setbacks on the Normandy front, Hitler decided that the counterattack would take place at Mortain. It would be led by the 2nd Panzer Das Reich Division. Its mission, beyond all reality, was to throw the Allies back into the sea.
Feuerkommando! 384 Krieg! Die Violette 192 Salve!
Mortain counteroffensive, quickly halted by the Royal Air Force, was another fiasco. Heinz Barth was evacuated from the front to have his wounded leg amputated. The Das Reich was decimated. From over 200 operational panzers, it was reduced to 15. Elimar Schneider was caught up in the turmoil.
Wherever the going was tough, our company was involved. Mortain, Domfront, Argentin, Falaise. All these names remind me of episodes, but I can't place them exactly. With hunger gnawing away at us, we climbed the apple trees, but the apples were always too green and weren't good for you. In fact, everything here was too green. The soldiers too young, the officers too young. Even the weapons we couldn't try out before for lack of ammunition. There were so many dead and wounded that one more or less made no difference, unless we're talking about comrades.
Even in the heart of the battle, the Waffen-SS divisions continued to hunt down partisans and notch up war crimes. On August the 13th, 1944, 18 people were eliminated in Tourouvre dans l'Orne and part of the town burnt. American prisoners of war were summarily executed by the Das Reich on the pretext that they looked Jewish. A German defeat was no longer in doubt. The 100,000 soldiers in the field, the remains of around 30 divisions in tatters, were overwhelmed by the Allied battering. On August the 14th, the Wehrmacht Chiefs of Staff gave the order for a general withdrawal. Already weakened by the loss of 28,000 prisoners of war and 12,000 deaths in July, the Germans lost an additional 10,000 soldiers in the Falaise pocket. 50,000 were taken prisoner.
Dans l'énorme charnier de Caen jusqu'à la Seine, Hitler a vu sa puissante armée réduite en lambeaux par les blindés britanniques. Là, l'Allemagne a dû payer ses dettes. Pendant 40 jours de combats acharnés, Montgomery a fixé les blindés allemands. Puis, ce fut le déluge de fer et de feu noyant la puissance allemande. D'abord, un par un, puis par centaines, les prisonniers allemands sont dirigés vers les camps de concentration, édifiés par leurs soins à l'intention des patriotes français.
The Das Reich was but a shadow of the elite division it once was. Those who miraculously survived the Battle of Falaise slipped through Allied fingers at the last minute. They crossed the Seine at Elbeuf before crossing the Ardennes. They then disappeared the other side of the Siegfried Line while the Allies were making for Paris. On August the 15th, the Allied landings in Provence on the French Mediterranean coast opened a new front to the west and accelerated the disintegration of the German forces, putting an end to any remaining hopes of recovery. In Paris, the staff prepared to withdraw. the Gestapo's most valuable prisoners, resistance leaders and SOE agents, were evacuated. Exhausted by the harsh interrogation, Violette Szabo had lost none of her determination. While incarcerated, she had met up with two SOE comrades, Denise Bloch, 28, a first-class secret agent whose Jewish family had been rounded up by the Gestapo in 1942, and Lilian Rolf, 30, half Russian, half British radio operator, arrested during a French police crackdown. Violette spared no effort to come to their aid and comfort them. The nightmare was coming to an end, she promised them. In reality, it had only just begun. On August the 8th, the three women were taken to the Gare de l'Est station where a cattle train awaited them, destination Ravensbrück. Located some 90 kilometers from Berlin, this concentration camp for women was overcrowded. Thousands of female forced workers were piling up there. Resistance fighters of every nationality, as well as race internees, both Jewish and Gypsy. They served as an easily exploitable workforce for German industries in the region. Violette Szabo, Denise Bloch, and Lilian Rolf were sent to the munitions factory in Torgau. Working conditions were apocalyptic. For the three resistance women, all that mattered was surviving the camp. They never imagined that Belarus had been liberated by the Red Army, which was now marching on Berlin. While Paris had been liberated on August the 25th, the outline of the Great Reich was shrinking with each new Allied victory. But the war was not yet over. In September, US paratroopers failed to break through the front in the Netherlands. The following month, it was the Canadians who struggled to free up access to the port of Antwerp and fought a difficult battle at Escaut. Germany was bending, but not yielding. Hitler decided to attack the Anglo-Americans in the Ardennes, where they were billeted. The mountain range is close to the Siegfried Line, the equivalent of the Maginot Line, which runs along the border with the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Reputedly impassable, it had just been reinforced on the orders of the Führer. The German attack would be a chance to pierce the Allied front and retake Antwerp. This was the last chance saloon. It wasn't about winning the war anymore. It was about signing a separate peace on the Western Front. Back in Germany, where it had taken refuge, the Das Reich was licking its wounds. Alsatian Elimar Schneider, like the rest of the division, was recovering from the harsh fighting of the summer.
I celebrated my 18th birthday in Rosebeck. It was the first time we had some relative peace. The ranks of our battalion were swelling visibly. Young Hungarians and Germans joined us.
The news came in December. Hitler had given the order to take back the Ardennes from the Allies.
Zur Überraschung der Feindseite treten in den Morgenstunden des 16. Dezember starke deutsche Kräfte aus dem Westwall heraus zu einem völlig unerwarteten Angriff an. Hunderte von Batterien aller Kaliber tragen den Tod in den Feind. Zusammengeschossene amerikanische Infanterie. Hoch sind die blutigen Verluste der Amerikaner schon in den ersten Stunden.
Heinz Lammerding, who had recovered after being wounded in Normandy, was keen to get back on the horse. The Das Reich was renewing its offensive.
With the Rundstedt offensive triggered, it was action stations once again. After tasting the joys of life, we were scared again. Very scared of dying.
On December the 23rd, while the fighting raged around Bastogne and Saint-Vith, the Das Reich division made a sensational entry onto the battlefield. It fought without moderation to keep the Americans at bay. But once the front was set, the SS made no headway. Doubt set in. Alsatian Elimar Schneider sank, like the rest, into the American quagmire.
At night, while the corporal and I were sleeping the sleep of the just, our company received the order to take back a hill from the Americans. Another third of the company was out of action, and the Americans were still there.
Once the surprise had worn off, and the dire weather that prevented reinforcements being dropped and support bombing had dissipated, the Allies restarted air attacks and threw all their forces into the battle. In 3 days, German hopes were destroyed. On December the 26th, the Das Reich was defeated in Saint-Vith. Bastogne was liberated by General Patton. In the months following the Ardennes defeat, the men of the Das Reich were no more than cannon fodder. Dismantled into 3 groups to face the Soviet advance in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Dresden, the SS division was wiped out by the Soviets in the last exchanges of spring 1945. Like so many others, Aurel Kovac, who had picked out the hanged men in Tulle, was killed in the fighting. Those who escaped death and the Red Army fell back to Prague to surrender to the Americans. The whole of Germany was a heap of ruins. After Hitler's suicide in his bunker, Lammerding, whose last mission had been to defend Berlin, managed to slip through the mesh of the Allied net. Germany capitulated on May the 8th, 1945. Violette Szabo would not taste the victory to which she devoted her young life. Along with her SOE comrades Denise Bloch and Lilian Rolf, she was executed behind the Ravensbrück crematorium in February 1945. 2 months before the liberation of the camp by the Red Army. 3 months before the German surrender. Of 130,000 women deported to Ravensbrück, only 40,000 survived the forced labor and the medical experiments carried out in the camp. Violette's daughter, Tanya, awaiting her return in London, wasn't 3 years old. She would later receive the most prestigious decorations awarded to her mother by the British and French authorities.
Le général visite Oradour-sur-Glane, anéanti par les Allemands. Vous êtes notre sauveur, lui a dit le maire d'Oradour. Nous vous demandons d'être notre vengeur. Après une visite au cimetière de cette ville cimetière, le général de Gaulle a dit « Si nos amis nous aident, tant mieux. Mais il nous appartient de faire justice et d'empêcher le renouvellement de tels crimes. »
The war was over, but the crimes of the Das Reich lived on in memory. From 1946, the Tulle hangings and the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane were mentioned in post-war courtrooms. At the Nuremberg trials, the prosecution tried in vain to find out who had given the order for the massacres. none of the Das Reich officers was present, the question remained unanswered. Until the beginning of the next decade. In January 1953, after 7 years' investigation, the Oradour-sur-Glane trial opened in Bordeaux. A law passed in September 1948 enabled the collective responsibility of the accused to be tried. It had been passed in order to sentence the SS for its crimes, for it had been established at the Nuremberg trials that it was a criminal organization. Robert Ebras and Marguerite Roufanche, 2 of the 6 survivors, came to present their testimony. The military court in Bordeaux had to investigate the responsibilities of 21 accused, including 14 Alsatians who claimed they were innocent. They were press-ganged into the SS, they protested. They were known as the Malgré nous, which means against our will. The verdict, delivered on the night of February the 12th, triggered a wave of protests. There was only one death sentence and some hard labor. The victims' families deplored the leniency of the judgment. Those of the Alsatians sentenced to hard labor or prison cried injustice. They were all amnestied the following year on the altar of national reconciliation. Outraged, the families of the Oradour martyrs engraved the names of the 319 members of parliament who voted to pass the amnesty law on the sign at the entrance to the ruined village. Up until 1968, they would not allow any representatives of the French Republic to attend commemorations. The protests also concerned those hanged in Tulle. The victims' families pushed for the extradition of Heinz Lammerding, the Das Reich general who had issued the order for the hangings. Sentenced to death in absentia at the trial in Tulle in 1949, the former Waffen-SS officer was living a quiet life in West Germany, as this December 1965 report shows.
Lammerding habite ici, 1 rue des Faucons, à côté de l'aéroport de Düsseldorf. À Düsseldorf, aujourd'hui, Lammerding est dans l'annuaire. Il est entrepreneur de travaux publics, son nom figure sur ses camions, et pendant les 3 jours de ce reportage, il nous a été impossible, même par surprise, de le rencontrer.
Despite several extradition requests, all rejected by the German federal authorities, Lammerding was never bothered. He died aged 66 in Bavaria on January the 13th, 1971. His comrades in the SS and the Das Reich paid him a glowing tribute at his funeral. Seven years later, Otto Kahn, one of those responsible for the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre, died in his turn near Munich without ever having to answer charges for his acts. He was 69. Heinz Barth, his subordinate, although sentenced to death in absentia in Bordeaux in 1953, made a career in an industrial cooperative. But his past did catch up with him, and he was finally tried in 1983 by a West German court.
Im Auftrag des Generalstaatsanwalts der Deutschen Demokratischen Republik erhebe ich Anklage gegen den ehemaligen Obersturmführer der Waffen-SS, Heinz Barth, geboren am 15. Oktober 1920. Ich beschuldige ihn, an Kriegsverbrechen und Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit mitgewirkt zu haben.
Robert Ebras, the Oradour survivor who had come to testify in Bordeaux, made the journey. Heinz Barth's trial was also followed in France. The media and the TV news gave it prominent coverage.
Heinz Barth a 63 ans, toute sa tête et une mémoire absolument parfaite. Il est autorisé à s'asseoir car il a été amputé d'une jambe après la bataille de Normandie. Il parle devant le tribunal comme devant le tableau noir, c'est-à-dire qu'il récite sagement, précisément son histoire. C'est l'histoire banale d'un SS minable devenu tortionnaire et assassin pour la seule raison qu'il voulait être promu officier.
Sentenced to life imprisonment for his part in the Lidis and Oradour massacres, Barth was released in 1997. He died 10 years later in Grancy, town of his birth, after a quiet retirement at the age of 87. Of the 15,000 men who took to the road with the Das Reich, only a handful had to answer for its crimes. Death sentences and life sentences were all amnestied or commuted to less severe penalties. The reasons cited were rebuilding, national reconciliation, and the Cold War. Of the Alsatian volunteers and the against our wills that made up the lion's share of the troops in 1944, none served the slightest prison sentence. The Alsatian Elmer Schneider was one of them. Convinced he had saved a man from hanging, Schneider wasn't charged at the Tulle trial. And because he wasn't present in Oradour during the massacre, his case was never tried. Yet doubts persisted about his enlistment in the SS. In 1982, he expressed no regrets.
Je ne suis pas d'accord lorsqu'on déclare toujours que les Waffen-SS étaient des meurtriers. Il y a une question d'honneur qui joue là-dedans. Ce que j'ai vu faire par la résistance rouge du Limousin ne m'incitait pas du tout à devenir déserteur. Je suis resté dans la troupe pour éviter de devenir un meurtrier.
C'est aussi un ordre puissant où chaque membre reçoit une instruction morale et politique